Welcome, Melanie Challenger. It's such a joy to meet you. I love your book so much, and I'm happy that we have a chance to speak today.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks. Years ago, I interviewed E.O. Wilson, which was really one of the great experiences of my life. And he was talking about the blowback to sociobiology and having the water thrown in his face. You say in the book, we mustn't allow the moral nature of human beings to be an animal thing. And can we? I want to talk about whether you've had blowback to that idea in the way that Ed Wilson had.
So yeah, to be clear, I know what you're saying. So essentially, I was saying that people have feared throughout history our morality, naturalizing our morality. So a natural understanding of what morality is. In fact, early philosophers spent a lot of time doing this, trying to make sense of where action came from in a very, natural questions, and the sorts of questions that a scientist like E.O. Wilson would ask were profoundly interwoven with moral and everyday questions about a good life. But we, in the parting of the two cultures, we now like to keep science and ethics really far apart. And it's problematic for both. Actually, it's problematic for how we do science well, and it's problematic for how we understand morality. And what I found is that it's been very common recently, and certainly from probably the Middle Ages onwards, for us to be very threatened by the idea that we are animals and that our morality therefore should be to get a fully comprehensive understanding about it, needs to be understood as a natural evolutionary, so I'm not going to say byproduct, but part of our natural history. We find that threatening, however, not least because of where we want to place our moral foundation. So of course it was threatening from a religious perspective, because the moral foundation is no longer straightforwardly God. God isn't just the origin of good, if you like, but it's also threatening in terms of a more secular perspective on morality, because it gets us into some very gnarly territory that we become uncomfortable with. It muddies and blurs the edges, because out there, morality doesn't seem to exist in any straightforward way. Nature, red in tooth and claw. And so that's really why we've preferred to separate them out. And I try to muddy them back together again.
Yes. And so have you had blowback to the ideas in your book?
Yeah, so actually I was incredibly sensitive, and I want to say compassionate. I was certainly very, very cautious when I was writing the book in terms of people who have a deep faith. I have lots of people in my life who have a deep faith. I don't. I'm not atheist. I like to call myself agnostic, but I'm certainly, I don't have any religious background. And so I still was very respectful of that as the first sort of set of problems that I might face. I wanted to be very supportive of, and inclusive of people who had that point of view, so that they wouldn't turn away from the book, and that you could maybe make space for God, if you like, within this. But it was going to be very problematic for literal interpretations of scripture, for instance. And I talked to an imam, I talked to a rabbi, I talked to pastors about the ideas to try to see how they would land. And actually, I had a little bit of blowback. There's been one or two kind of image of God sort of strong reactions to the book, but as a general rule, I've actually feel like it's had a real, I've had some really good interfaith conversations since the book that have been really quite positive. It's actually within ethics, sort of secular ethics, that I would say I've had sort of nice kind of but tense conversations. I work within ethics, as you probably know, within bioethics. And there is a resistance to looking at sort of evolutionary origins of our morality and ethics within, which is ironic for the life sciences, but there we go. We prefer not to sort of to do that. And part of that is because of the high level of exploitation of non-human animals, because there's a sort of real vested interest in being quite human exceptionalist about the ethics that we do in the modern day. So that's probably been where there's been some tension, I would say.
So more from the humanists than the transcendentalists.
I would say so. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And that really gets to what you talk about, that we are the only moral predator on the planet. And you say the only way to avoid the spread of moral compassion to other animals is to come up with a radical lie. So let's talk about this radical lie. And, and
it's a little bit provocative when I hear it said back to me. I have to, as a thinker, be willing to go, and I hope that doesn't sound too grandiose a term to use myself, but I have to be willing to go fearlessly, because otherwise I cannot go honestly as I see it as a writer or as someone trying to write about these sorts of themes. And that means that I know I'm going into uncomfortable territory for lots and lots of people's everyday lives. So for instance, I live rurally. I've lived rurally for a very long time. So I'm surrounded by people who hunt, who shoot, who farm, who slaughter animals at a high level. But then I also work with lots and lots of scientists who use animals in their labs and in experiments routinely. So I know that what I'm saying, I understand really deeply, not just the worldviews, but the practices that might be complicated by this. But you can't think like that. I'm not a politician here. I'm doing intellectual survey. And the reality is, when I start going into it, I have to try to make sense of how we have thought about ourselves. So I needed to try to make sense morally, in terms of moral philosophy, of what we think it is that draws the line between us and all other species. Because the reality is, for most modern civilizations or modern industrial civilizations, we'll park indigenous worldviews for the moment, which are different, is that there is a strict legal, ethical and moral boundary between us and all other life forms. And that sort of encrusted around that tight line are some very sort of philosophically problematic ideas. Do we have a substance that is the source of this moral difference? Is it dignity? Is it free will? Is it personhood? Is it subject? What is it? And so I had to go into those weeds. And the reality is once you start really trying to pin these things down, it turns out they are simply useful ideas that justify a bias. You know, they are, you can understand where they've come from. There is some sense to it. It's not complete madness, but at the same time, it isn't a neat line. It just isn't. And therefore, we are doing things realistically to other species that are deeply unpleasant for them and are morally questionable by our own standards, if we were to follow our standards to their logical conclusions. So, and to try to make sense of how we've done that, I didn't want to just rely on sort of, you know, earlier impoverished ideas that haven't quite been, you know, dusted out yet, like our ideas about women, like our ideas about people of a different skin color to us, that we're still having to sort out, for that matter, but relied on false ideas in the past that then hardened into prejudice and justification. Similar things, of course, are happening with non-human animals, but it's more complicated than that for us because of the high level of utilization of other species and the fact that we are predatory. So I think it is really important to understand, when we're going back to what we were talking about, moral, naturalizing morality, understanding where our morality comes from, to understand that our morality is constrained by the fact that we are not herbivores, we're carnivores. We kill to absorb energy, and we kill to wear clothes, and we kill to for pleasure. And that makes us a complicated moral animal.
Let's talk a little bit about the invention of personhood. This is such a given for most people that how can you say that I'm not a person? Let's talk about the roots of personhood. How does that begin? How do we justify the notion that there is this thing in us that is exceptional? Where does it come from?
Sure. It's really difficult to answer this question, firstly, without sort of beggaring the history a little bit, because it's a really long, in some way, it's a very long, complicated history, and it's a set of histories as well, because, it involves the traffic of ideas across different trade routes, different countries, different centuries, different cultures, a little bit, and this is the way with the kind of incredibly culturally promiscuous species that we are, that we share all these ideas, and then we end up with these sorts of extraordinary ideas that if you start following their genealogy, it's sort of beautiful and bizarre all at once. And personhood is certainly, for me, I'm not one of these self is an illusion kind of a characters. For me, personhood is an all-purpose term for multiple aspects of our perceptual and cognitive experience. But to narrow it down a bit, we're most often really talking about our subjectivity, so our subjective consciousness, so our awareness of us, our awareness of what we are, because cells have to kind of have a basic sense of self. You have to have some self-recognition to know when, I don't know, like a bacteriophage has come in. You have to be able to know this is alien and not me, and this is me. So at a very, very proto level, even cells, let alone organisms, must have some kind of self module, if you like, recognition of self at some level or multiple levels within them. But once you arrive at organisms like us, we know, of course, from our own experience, that we have long, flexible, extending memories that create this identity. And we have hour by hour, minute by minute abilities to reflect on ourselves internally, and to reflect on how others see us, and to reflect on the selves that we come across. So personhood is describing something profoundly important to our survival, profoundly important to our negotiations with the world, and very real. For me, very biological. Very, very, very complex. Where it came from exactly is a great and marvelous mystery, but we know it's there. Where we run into problems is in two separate areas of how we thought about it through history. The first is the idea that it is a non-physical substance. So this is substance dualism. And again, this is, a long, complicated history, but in essence, we still have that kind of substance dualism with us today. The idea of a kind of legal person, if you like, as morally special is very hard to make sense of in terms of why we would have it and why a chimpanzee wouldn't have it. Chimpanzees, many of the mammals around us clearly have some sense of self, clearly have a sense of each other, clearly have complex relationships, clearly have sentience. So why do they have no legal personhood and we do? In order to do this, we rely on some idea that we have this, it's a faint echo of an ancient idea that the mind and body must be made of separate essences somehow. And we haven't quite managed to dispel that idea. So that's part of where the kind of exceptionalism comes from, are these ancient intuitions that it really does feel like there is a me being carried around by my body. And it sort of feels like the me is up here somehow, because we're so visual, of course, because this is part of our brain. So, and a lot of the phenomenon of the phenomena of what we're calling personhood is brain-based, of course, but it's brain-based in connection with the whole of the rest of the body. So you can suddenly get a bit more of a different me feel if you start fiddling around with your hands and fingers. But, you know, for a really long time, you know, we were just trying to make sense of that. And the kind of folk biological feeling is that you are carrying a me around, that it is a different substance. And then, of course, you've got philosophers like Descartes who give us our kind of mind-body dualism idea, although it was a complicated mind-body dualism. But the assumption was, therefore, that other animals didn't have that. They were just the body bit, and only we had this separate personhood. And we haven't really moved on from that, despite overwhelming scientific evidence to the contrary. We still haven't quite, you know, from Darwin onwards, who gave us really good starting point, and now vast amounts of both genetic and behavioral science, we still haven't quite accepted the fact that clearly we are not the only persons out there.
Right. And underlying this resistance, you think, is fear of death? All the disgust reactions we have to the animal body, to incarnation. Is that really what's driving this resistance?
Well, that's exceptionalism broadly. Yeah, I got very interested. I sort of had a really, I don't remember quite where it began. It was a long time ago, where I was kind of mulling the strangeness of the need for human uniqueness. And in particular, I was interested by why we don't actually always see personhood in one another. So I got particularly interested in dehumanization. So not just human exceptionalism, but the kind of strange dark fellow of that, which is our ability to dehumanize one another. I mean, that in part came out of earlier research or work that I did on conflict and wartime, and just hearing a lot of testimony of the sorts of things that we do, particularly Jewish testimony of the Holocaust, when I worked with various survivors. And I had to try to make sense of how a compassionate moral creature like us, I didn't want to turn them all into monsters, someone who had perfect faculties available to them, convinced themselves that simply because someone was Jewish, that they weren't human, or that you were justified. You know, the same could be said of the slave trade, for instance. How do you get into that place? And so through dehumanization, I was trying to look at kind of what was really going on there. And for me, I eventually, through a long route and lots of research, particularly sort of reading up on the science of it, got to a position where for me, it's not really dehumanization, or that's problematic for me. For me, it's more broadly dementalization. So we actually strip others of mind, and we do other things as well. We kind of replace them with frightening essences, disgust essences, for instance. So we see them as frightening animals, predatory animals. We see them as plague, pathogen-bearing animals. You know, we play with our biology to and our image and idea of others, but fundamentally what we're doing is stripping them of mind, stripping them of all of their agency, their feeling, their sentience, or devaluing it in some way, or making it hostile in some way, to create a different kind of relationship, to disrupt what ought to be an affiliative relationship with a fellow human being. And it struck me that we were probably doing a similar thing with non-human animals in a different kind of way. So I started really looking at where we particularly tend to do that. And we particularly tend to do that in relationships of exploitation. So it is when we either want to ignore, so if it's a homeless person, for instance, someone who we just don't want to be bothered to deal with, we ignore all of their cries for help, all of their humanness, all of their beauty. We just ignore all of that, and we shut them out and we dehumanize them. But if we want to exploit them because they're an African slave in the slave trade era, then we do the same thing. We strip them of mind, strip them of agency, we dementalize them, dehumanize them in order to enable us to do something we know is abhorrent to them. And similarly, I started looking at how we interact with non-human animals, and it turns out that we see similar kinds of mechanisms at work in slaughterhouses, for instance. So we're often, so that's part of what's going on. But then the other side of it is when does uniqueness, this kind of drive for exceptionalism, really kick in? And that tends to kick in when we are increasing our group, sort of intergroup. So that's all about outgroups, isn't it, in some ways? What I was talking about then, and particularly outgroups that are competitive or exploitative in some way. And then there's the in-group, where all of the positive affiliative stuff happens, but it often tends to also involve the opposite of that, dehumanization. So we tend to then sort of almost over-humanize one another. We prefer the ideas for our in-group. We think our in-group are smarter, that they have better ideas, that they're the ones we should really listen to, that we're, you know, and you see this in sort of tribe groups everywhere, whether that tribe is the local chess group or the local football group, or it's actually a literal tribe. You know, you can see similar sorts of things going on in indigenous tribe groups as well, where there's often a much stronger sense of kind of preference and humanness within the group identity versus the out-group identity. So this is a kind of deep mechanism. All of that's sort of in the background. And then to get round to your question, what is it that really, we've seen exploitation is one of the things that these kind of basic capabilities of group behavior, social cognitive group behavior, get really pressed on. The other one, it turns out, is related to threats. So human beings are in groups because we're a group living animal. We're a social group living animal because it has a survival advantage for us, like other group living animals. And that means that we biologically feel good when we're close to one another. You know, if you get a horrifying diagnosis, for instance, and you're next to a family member or even just, you know, a close group member, you'll feel better, you'll cope better with it, your whole body will cope better. This is called social immunity. So we gain physical benefits, this is called social buffering. So we gain sort of physical benefits from the knocks of life, from the stresses and threats of life by our group. And that for us can happen both in the idea of the group and physically just by being with one another. And of course, the biggest threat that we face is death. So it's hardly surprising that when facing threats of any kind, but particularly existential threats, we reinforce this idea of the group. And when that group also involves a tendency to kind of excess mentalize our group, to kind of fully humanize our group, you can start to see where the very business of being alive slightly predisposes us towards a kind of human exceptionalism. That was a really long-winded answer. I'm sorry, there's so much ground to cover.
I think you nailed it. So how are you seeing that play out now with the pandemic? I mean, it feels like you have just a perfect, perfect sort of example of all of this, from contagion issues to dehumanizing issues to exceptionalism issues. What do you see as a researcher, and having written this book, when you look at the global landscape of what's happening with COVID?
I mean, there's a huge amount to go into here. So when I wrote the book, as you will know, there's even a chapter that with pathogens in there. So pathogens are one of the key dangers that all organisms face, from single cell organisms through to complex beings like us. And so all animals have kind of incredible defense systems, but it's also very normal for animals to face the threat of pathogens, and it's very, very stressful. And we have all sorts of techniques. If you think about a hospital is in some ways an externalized immune system. Like, our immune systems are incredible at coping with pathogens, absolutely staggeringly remarkable. and do a really, really good job. We're exposed to pathogens all the time, and most of the time our immune systems deal with it, and we never even know we came into contact with one. We're pretty good, but it's never going to be perfect. And human beings have got to the stage now where we've sort of externalized our immune systems with these super immune systems, which are our medical infrastructure and all of the kind of technologies we have available to us. So I think where we've arrived at now is a stage, and actually interesting to talk about Harari, because I wonder how he feels about the opener to his book now, because it's ever so slightly dated, which is not too in any way. I mean, every book will date little parts of it, of course, especially if you're trading in history or science. But he sort of talks about the fact that we've beaten kind of the plague now, and obviously no, not quite. It turns out actually that we're increasing the number of potential spillover pathogens that we're facing or have done in the 20th century. There's been a kind of increase. Pandemics are fairly normal in human history, but we're incredibly well equipped to cope with one, but we're probably less mentally well equipped to cope with one. We've convinced ourselves that we're not going to fall foul of something like this again, and we've also assumed that those external immune systems will just deal with us, that we won't die, that somehow we'll be safe. And actually, it's interesting having these daily counts of deaths, because I think if we were to do the same every day for heart attacks, for people not getting access to good food, whether that's just having a really crappy diet because you haven't got the money to buy decent, organic food, or because that's you actually really are living in an environment where you can't access good nutrition, whether you're looking at malaria, whether you're looking at flu deaths every season, human beings die in large numbers all the time, and we hide it away in our society. And so there is absolutely no question in my mind that the impacts of the pandemic and those death counts on us psychologically will be enormous and far-reaching, and I suspect we haven't seen them yet. So to go into that in a bit more detail, going back to that social cognition stuff, we buffer ourselves from pathogens through, partly in our relationships with one another. So we support one another physically, and we also, the idea of our relationship or our affiliations or our group, support us. Now, the pre-COVID landscape was already a landscape that was very divisive politically all around the world. A rise again of nationalist ideas, a rising up of isolationism and national exceptionalist ideas, and a lot of sort of partisan politics going on. So, and we can speculate on what kinds of forces and whether there were also psychological forces at play in that. With large population across the globe at the moment, we've got resource shortages, we've got threats like climate change. You can see it's a little bit of a troubling time at the moment that might explain some aspects of that kind of preference for sort of strongman politics and authoritarian politics and so forth, and groupishness. But then you throw into the mix a pandemic, a real threat, an existential threat, and is in as much as all pathogens to a certain extent are existential threats, even though it's not existential on a global level. And then you have a media that's reporting deaths and the death cycle constantly. And you have everybody locked in their houses. Now, we aren't at the stage yet of being able to see what the consequences of that would be, but I can absolutely guarantee from my research that there will be an uptick in groupishness, I would imagine. We've already talked a lot about the fact that there has been a huge mental health cost, which one would anticipate. But if I think about something like 9/11, for instance, or wars more generally, not only is there a physical cost to pay for the stress of going through an event like that, that often people will still be dealing with, perhaps in their health, years later. But there is often, certainly for 6 months plus, a year plus, sometimes for a lifetime afterwards, can be political shifts in how their politics works, shifts in what they'll pay for, how they'll consume, how they'll vote, whole worldview shifts that can happen as a consequence of stress. And I do worry about how the pandemic in that respect is likely to affect us in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's change course a little bit and talk on a more everyday sort of personal level. You say, you talk about many of the things that give us the most joy come out of our animal nature. Things like music, love of music, things like love. How does denying our animal reduce our quality of life and our ability to really savor our lives and connect with other people?
Well, I think the most obvious way in which, to preface this before we sort of answer that, so what we've been talking about, very broadly, of aspects of the just central thesis of the book, which is to argue that we have, in different ways and in different cultures and in different ways through time, have had a tendency to prefer the idea that we're not really animals, that we're something else, we're humans, we're special humans, we're a special creature, or that we are made up of soul rather than biology, and it's had lots of different forms. And then to go back to all of the social cognition stuff, we've had this idea that one of the reasons that has been a favoured line of thinking across the world and through time is firstly because of the threats that we face as an animal, which are very real, and the biggest threat being that, of course, we're mortal. And so it buffers us from that. And also because it makes it morally easier for us as the kind of predatory and yet deeply compassionate organism that we are, it's suited us to have this kind of idea that our moral world originates in this kind of specialness, whatever it is, this human specialness, and it only works for us. It doesn't work for any other animal in the world, and therefore we can't really be animals because we can't have that much continuity with them. So that's the general thesis that we're kind of talking around with one another now. So if we think about where that then leads us, apart from all of the problems that we've kind of rehearsed up to now, is also that we've got to a stage where I actually think there's a very surprising lack of understanding about all that's positive that flows from being an animal. So in some ways, it robs us of our agency, because if we don't want to believe that it is ultimately our biology at work, that our biology is incredibly fundamental, which is not to say that abstract ideas aren't key, but abstract ideas still have to have an effect on our endocrine system, on our physical action in the world. It still all has to ground and filter through and manifest in biology at heart. So what the most immediate and obvious way that I think it matters to us is that it robs us of the opportunity to know how to bring out the best in ourselves. So that can be in a very, very small way. So going back to what I was talking about with the pandemic, understanding that the best way, initially to cope with incredibly challenging diagnosis or an end of life scenario for an individual is through physical touch, proximity to the people that matter to you. That's why it was, for me, a deeply ethically dubious, I understand why, and I understand it was imperfect, but an ethically dubious decision to deny parents and families and the dying the chance to physically be with one another. We should have really thrown everything at the protocol there to reduce risk to anybody else, because that's where the moral dilemma is. But if you are dying yourself, or you are going to go through grief, you need your body to be on your side in that. You need to reduce the stress level that your body will be experiencing. And a lot of that comes simply through holding hands, for instance, touching one another, stroking one another, talking to one another. It's physical animal stuff. It all resurfaces the bonds that we have in early infancy. Deeply mammalian, lots of other organisms, lots of other mammals do things like rubbing up to one another when they're stressed. If a young mammal encounters a predator and survives it, they'll huddle with a close member of their group or their kin in order to get their kind of homeostasis back. So just understanding that and how to help us to cope with the knocks of life can often come through treating our bodies well, through, and the same in terms of, you know, understanding that it really does matter what you eat. It really does matter that you exercise. So for mental health problems, the first line of defense is not Prozac, it's physical exercise. It's, you know, which is not to say one shouldn't medicate at a dangerous stage, but I just mean we really need to understand that our bodies affect our minds, that you do need to treat the whole body on a day-to-day basis to live well. So I think there's just so many ways in which that is true, that similarly, I think, you know, it would help young people if they understood their sexual natures better. It would help us to make better moral decisions and better ethical decisions if we understood where our behavior was coming from. You know, if we understood the kind of hierarchical primate that we are a particular kind of primate with a particular kind of, and nobody likes this. Of course, this was the hot water that E.O. Wilson got into with his kind of sociobiological ideas. People were like, I'm not a monkey. What are you talking about? Exactly. Don't dehumanize me. Yes. But actually, it empowers you if you understand your natural history as an organism. It helps you to make sense of things that otherwise can see. Why on earth is that person driving fast in that car in an incredibly dangerous way when they're 22? You know, it really helps.
Biology could have something to do with it.
It really helps. And you can therefore advise young people to know, you know, what they're up against, to know what their bodies are doing, to not be frightened of the changes that are happening, but to also gain some self-control. Understand that you're going to be more impulsive, therefore you might make some bad decisions. You're just arming one another with good, you know, common sense knowledge. It would be a very positive step forward across society, I think.
Yeah, but in denying our animal nature, we also cut ourselves off from the body's intelligence, which is such an important point that you make. That we forget all that we know, viscerally, biologically, by privileging the mind and it's kind of hiding out in this spaceship of the mind, where it feels like I visualize that we think we have this little pod here that we can just kind of take off out of the body inside.
Sure, and also I think there is, I mean, there are problems that follow from this. The most obvious one is the fear of biological essentialism, I should say. So there's actually a push within scientific narrative now to kind of get away from the biology. And I understand where it's coming from. I understand that it's coming from essentially a push against, in particular, racism, because there has always been a desire to abuse, sometimes usually bad science, to cherry pick some bad science to justify a prejudice. But sometimes that can mean that we become fearful of biology. We think that biology is going to be very reductive, that it's going to be essentialist in some way. My own feeling on that is, yes, sometimes if you really pay attention to the biology, you're going to come across limitations that feel uncomfortable, but they don't have to be moral limitations. I honestly don't think there is anything you could come across in biology, not only because there's huge amounts of individual variation across our species and across all species, but also because you're not going to find, I mean, human beings are so similar, for instance, you're not going to find that, you're just not going to find that there's a straightforward race. You're not going to find that there's a less intelligent race. You're never going to find that in biology. The science is never going to find that. That's all just a nonsense. So, you know, we don't need to fear biology in that kind of way. And similarly, focusing on a biology isn't going to mean that human beings don't matter anymore, that we are dragged down to some kind of animal level. But what it probably does mean is that we have to lift up with us many of the life forms that live alongside us, that more acceptance of the fact that so much of what matters to us and so much of what flows from us is fundamentally biological, and deeply valuable and deeply shared across the biotic community is going to have moral ramifications for us, for sure, or for other species and our relationship to them. But I don't think we should fear our biology, because I just don't think it's going to prop up our unpleasant prejudices.
Right. And I love what you talk about, the fact that we are such contradictions. You say we're the only animal that's partly not natural, that we're animals when we embrace and we give birth, but not when we make vows. We're animals when we bite into a piece of meat, but not in our workplaces. We're animals on the operating table, but not in a court of law. You know, how can we begin to better bridge this contradiction?
I mean, I think about this all the time, and you know, I don't have any answers for how this could play out in the economics, or how this plays out in the cultural side of it. I can respond to. So, you know, the consequence of what I was talking about in that passage there, in accepting that fundamentally we are animals, that there isn't this separate special human that gives us the right to dominion, that gives us the right to do what we will, either to another human being or to another life form, that the earth isn't giving us that, and nor does our biology give us that. We have to use it. We do have to falsify reality in order to justify that kind of outlook. What it would mean if we let go of that would be we would instantly widen the moral circle. I mean, the reality is that the biggest, most immediate change would not be that it would demote us in any way, but as I've said already, it would open out the field of moral subjects much more widely now, and we would have to renegotiate our relationship to many other species and rethink the kinds of relationships that we can and should be having. Now, I had an interesting kind of conversation with the writer Will Self, and he was, as is his wont, being very provocative with me, but deeply intelligently. He was sort of needling me and saying, yeah, but you don't really believe morality. You know, morality is an invention, right? You know, these value systems are an invention. Like, surely you kind of understand that, and therefore, you know, it's all a bit made up. And to a certain extent, you know, I see what he's getting at. But again, if we naturalize morality, if we say that we are a moral animal, that it serves us emotionally, psychologically, and physically to behave in moral ways, if we find ourselves in a situation where we have had to accept, as we did, you know, as we have done throughout history, we've had to expand our moral circle when we've really come up against evidence that we were being prejudiced in our behaviour, we're probably going to have to do that with other species now if we really confront our morality, our animality. And I think that won't be a problem for culture. You know, I recognise that would bring certain ways of life to an end. But I think it's always really important to remember that ways of life never die. Usually what happens is that the actual physical industry dies, and this has happened thousands of times throughout history, you know, if a resource ends, or if an old, you know, new technology comes along and an old technology becomes moribund, you know, a whole way of life does die, but usually it enters into a kind of cultural heritage stage, and it becomes about our history and our past and our identity, and that's totally fine. You know, cowboys still dress like cowboys, but they're not droving on their you know, they're not on their horses, you know, they're usually on a helicopter taking their you know, their herds around. You know, it's different. These old ways of life come to an end, but we retain things that become part of our identity. So I don't worry about that. People would reskill, they would go somewhere else, they would do something different. We've always done that throughout history. But, you know, what it would mean for how we buffer ourselves, you know, would be more provocative. So what would we need to give us our emotional and spiritual sustenance if we didn't have human exceptionalism anymore? How would we have to think about our own deaths, and how would we have to think about the meaning of what it is to be human, and how would we think about human progress? That would take some proper soul searching, I think.
Right. Just a couple more questions. We're running out of time. I'd like to ask you about the impact of this de-animalization, or our fear and revulsion toward being animals, and how we treat women. You know, how does that affect misogyny?
Yeah, so some really interesting science. Someone who's done a lot of work on this is a psychologist called Jamie Goldenberg, but there's a bunch of interesting researchers who've looked at the way in which our animality, or our awareness of our animality, and the fact that women are, you know, and how that might threaten this kind of buffering worldview, this sort of exceptionalist worldview that we hold, how that then plays out in terms of women, because particularly pregnant women, on the one hand, it sort of feels counterintuitive to say it would be a problem, because we can see that the female form has often been revered, particularly the pregnant form, throughout human history, and still in some ways to this day. And yet when when these researchers started setting up their studies to kind of test their ideas, they found a slightly more complicated picture. So for instance, they found that there would be a higher aversion towards breastfeeding if someone had gone through a threat of some kind, or was feeling sort of like they were wanting to, you know, push away the idea of being animal. And there've also been interesting studies done on whether or not someone exposing males in particular to threats, and then seeing how they responded to overt displays of female sexuality, and again found that the control group that hadn't been exposed to the threat was kind of about average-ish, whereas the group that had been exposed to the threat had a more aversive reaction to overt displays of femininity, or femaleness, I should say. So, and these studies have been reasonably successfully repeated. They're difficult. It's always difficult to repeat this kind of science and reproduce the results, but it's looking pretty robust over time. That there's something going on here. That certainly it's the female form is both alluring and appealing as the source of life, and we revere it and seek to treasure it, and at the same time it's threatening. And if you look at many kind of hunter-gatherer taboos, for instance, a lot of them are around menstruation or around the female reproductive form, and so it's not just about revering, it's often sometimes about hiding away or controlling in some ways aspects of female reproduction. You know, we're living through a very interesting time at the moment because of the fact that just being female has become kind of, you know, such a live topic now. So I felt sort of in some ways concerned that it, you know, if I tried to talk about this too much, it would be seen as sort of trans exclusionary in any kind of way. But actually, you know, it certainly wouldn't be from my perspective whatsoever. In fact, I think we could really, biology is a great ally to helping to sort out some of the kind of tensions that exist now. But there is no question for me that we still live in a society that doesn't understand or protect the complications and deeply animal realities of the female life cycle, whether that's the menopause or whether that's pregnancy. These are still, in many cultures, either controlled or hidden from sight in some way, and we're still not great at supporting the 0 to 3 years, you know, which are fundamentally work that is done in a woman's body and by women once the baby's out of the body. And it would really credit us as societies around the world if we could do better for women, I think.
Beautiful. And just one last question. We haven't said a word about technology. It's a huge topic. But what I found it provocative in the book, you said as danger increases, we escape more into technology as a sort of an extension of mind.
Yeah. So transhumanism is something that kind of crops up throughout the book. Transhumanism as a movement absolutely fascinates me because on the one hand, it purports to rely on science and has a kind of incredibly, valedictory kind of idea about our progress as a species and the upward trajectory of technology. And yet all of that is attached to these really ancient ideas that are fundamentally dualist. So the idea that we're all mind and we can somehow get what mind is onto a computer, we can get it to live forever, that we can, merge with machines and therefore become kind of superhumans. And that ultimately comes from those fears that we've talked about. So it's a refusal to die, a refusal to age, a refusal to accept that everything is mortal. Even a machine is mortal. It's just you're just changing the time scale or the kind of corrosive process that you might have to go through, but you're still going to be mortal. It fascinates me that way of thinking, that kind of movement that we're going through, which is a kind of eschatological movement, has risen up in the heart of the most kind of moneyed and technologically savvy communities on the earth. All of our major biotech companies, whether that's Zuckerberg, whether that's Elon Musk, whether that's Jeff Bezos, all of them are really working at the edges of aging technologies, of brain-machine interfaces, of trying to service technology so that the heads of these major corporations can somehow live forever, or that we can all somehow outrun our animality and our biology or upgrade it in some kind of way. And it's, I just worry for those individuals in some ways, because it's not going to happen. You will be able to enhance life to a certain extent, but enhancement is never going to be a straightforward line on a graph. It's going to be complicated in the way that we can see with plastic surgery. Plastic surgery emerged in the First World War to fix the disfigured faces of men who've been to war. And then it got co-opted by Hollywood to try and make women as fake genetics and make them look younger and more in the kind of reproductive beautiful ages that they wanted them to look. But you can still tell when someone's had plastic surgery. So then you end up with this weird kind of value system where it's like, well, they've had plastic surgery, so they're not really beautiful. And, you know, all of our natural biases kick in, and you end up with a kind of 1 grade, 2 grades of what beauty is and what it isn't. And enhancement is never straightforward. Would we end up with, you know, people who'd use technology to enhance themselves and then a kind of supposedly superior group who hadn't? You know, would we end up with it? You're still going to get all of that hierarchical primate psychology is still going to be playing out, and it's never going to be a straightforward process. And meanwhile, you know, you're ignoring all of the things that actually are usually most nurturing for us, which are those affiliative relationships. Ultimately, what makes for a good life for most of us is having a good relationship with our partners, having a good relationship with our kids, having a good relationship with our history, you know, doing good in the world. Ultimately, you know, it's an old story, but it's amazing that we still haven't kind of learned it, and not understanding that. You see, I'm all for robots in the household, freeing us up so that we don't have to do, you know, our kind of tedious tasks, making life easier for single mothers. I am totally up for that, you know. But and companion robots that, for instance, you know, using technology to support the best of our biology would be great. Using it to escape what we fear about our biology is going to end badly. I mean, it's so obvious, but you know, it's the stuff of our future kind of Greek myths, isn't it?
It is. It really is. Thank you so much for your time.
That's my pleasure.
We could have gone down into Hariri and his whole idea that the more elites are going to have more, are going to be better androids, and that anyway, we didn't go there. We didn't have time, but it's a thrill to talk to you, Melanie. Thank you so much. And thank you for your beautiful book.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much, Mark.